horse beef, man. I'm coming at you with another fucking tier list video. And off the back of the first knockout loss of Max Holloway's career, I figured that this is a pretty appropriate tier list to make. So today I'm going to be ranking my personal saddest UFC losses of all time. Now, there might be certain losses here that you might consider to be sad, like maybe if you're an Israel Adesanya fan, the DDP loss or the Sean Strickland loss or the Pereira loss would be quite sad, right? Or if you're an Usman fan, the Leon Edwards loss might be quite sad. But these are my personal fights that I consider to be sad, and I'm going to rank them accordingly. So as always, let me know any fight that you consider to be sad that you think is the saddest I left out here. It doesn't really matter, man. This is very subjective. So at the end of the day, if you disagree, you disagree. It doesn't really matter. Just let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, however way it goes, right? First one up, we have Conor McGregor versus Jose Aldo. Now, this one was tough because I've always been a huge Jose Aldo fan, and leading up to this fight, I was heavily picking Jose Aldo to win this one. I wasn't buying into the Conor McGregor hype train. I wasn't really a fan of the trash talk at the time either. Nowadays, I have more than warmed up to it. I actually quite enjoy it. I actually enjoy this current cokehead Conor McGregor more than any version of him. I must be honest here. But this did kind of upset me, but from what I remember, I also was a kid, right? I was like an early teenager when this knockout happened, so it wasn't enough to send me into a depression. Having watched it again recently, it's not as sad as I remember it being, because at the end of the day, it did set up Conor McGregor's performance against Eddie Alvarez, becoming double champ. So I would say at the end of the day, man, this one in particular wasn't super depressing. I would say it ruined my day. It probably did. But this one is a different case, man. Sandhagen versus Edgar. Was always a fan of Sandhagen, but it's never fun watching Frankie Edgar get knocked out by anybody. It doesn't matter who it is. It could be my boy Peter Yan, could start him in 10 seconds, and I would still be upset to watch Frankie Edgar get cleaned out like that. But this one, I would say crippling depression, was very sad, man. It's one of the best knockouts of all time when you really come down to it, but it was against Frankie Edgar, so fuck you, Corey Sandhagen, even though I love you. Volkanovski. Okay, let me click it. Volkanovski versus the Korean Zombie. Now, this one, I would say I was sad for a few minutes. It just didn't really make sense. I'm pretty sure the Korean Zombie was a short notice replacement. I forget for who exactly, but he should have never been in there in the first place, and I knew this was going to happen, so I was kind of mentally prepared for it. So the fact that it happened, it did upset me for a few minutes, but still a sad loss nonetheless. He got beaten from pillar to post, looked completely behind it, should have just never been in there in the first place. And then we get into Tyron Woodley versus Robbie Lawler. Now, this one was pretty tough. I would say it ruined my day. I would say so. Yeah, I was always a big fan of Robbie Lawler, but I was never like a super fan, I guess. So the reaction that I got out of me was like, yeah, day ruined, similar to that of Jose Aldo losing to Conor McGregor. Then we get into Jamal Hill versus Glover Teixeira. This one was tough, dude, because I never really rated Jamal Hill, although I kind of expected this to happen. He just looked so much bigger in there, and Glover Teixeira was in his 40s. I know he had won the belt in his 40s, but this just seemed like the perfect setup to watch him get his ass beat. And he got his ass completely beat by Jamal Hill, was getting his head kicked off pretty much at will, but kept surviving. And that honestly made it more sad because we witnessed Glover Teixeira go through such a massive beatdown at his age, being such a legend as he is. It was shitty to watch. I didn't enjoy it, really didn't. I would say mild depression for that one. Anderson Silva versus Uriah Hall. This one goes straight into the very top tier because it was just so sad. He pretty much knocked out Anderson Silva the way Anderson Silva had knocked out fighters in the past, right? Step back, pull counter, beautiful. But it's just the reaction from Uriah Hall, the level of respect, them crying together afterwards was so beautiful, but just led to it being completely fucking depressing, man. And honestly made me question my love for the sport. It seemed like a passing of the torch, but not really a passing of the torch because Uriah Hall didn't last much longer in the UFC after this win anyway. But then we get into Joaquin Buckley versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Now, this one was just recent, so I don't want to let recency bias play a part here because it did upset me. Although I would say it ruined my day because I'm a big Wonderboy guy. I really rate him, love watching him fight. And I just have this thing when it comes to rooting for old fighters, right? Like when fighters are still performing way past the age where it even makes sense, I just naturally want to root for those fighters. And the fact that Wonderboy was to a point putting a clinic on Joaquin Buckley, but then he just loaded up that big right hand It was like everything slowed down in real life for me too. I was just watching that right hook get closer and closer to Wonderboy's face, and then when it landed, he went down, and god damn it, man, my day was ruined, I must say. Then we get into Stipe Miocic's knockout loss against Francis Ngannou. This one was so brutal. It was so brutal that I kind of have to put it at crippling depression. The visual of it, him being folded over, the face that he made, just everything about it was completely sad. And I think everyone who was picking Stipe, including myself, expecting him to do the exact same thing. And this fight was just so ominous, right when Ngannou stuffed the first takedown, I think everybody had the same look of worry on their face and kind of knew, oh shit, this is going to be bad for Stipe. And it was terrible loss to witness. Gabriel Gonzaga's knockout win over Mirko Cro Cop. Now, I've always been a huge Cro Cop guy. He was one of my favorite fighters growing up, absolutely. So to watch him get cleaned out by a head kick, which was his signature at all times. Of course, it was the right head kick, and Mirko Cro Cop's signature was the left high kick, although his right high kick was nothing to scoff at either. But he got cleaned out by a right high kick from Gabriel Gonzaga. Rare technique to even see him throw in the first place, let alone knock out a legend of the sport with. I would say this one gives me mild depression. Ilia Toporia's knockout win over Max Holloway. Now, I'm going to say I wasn't even sad for a few minutes watching this one because I knew Ilia was going to win. I understood how good it was for the sport for him to knock out Max Holloway. So when it happened, it didn't really upset me, to be completely honest with you guys, but I decided to include it here because I am still a big fan of Max Holloway, although I understand how good Ilia is, so I completely expected this to happen. So mentally, I was prepared for this outcome. It happened as I expected, and for that reason, I wasn't really sad. So by definition, I do have to put this at the very, very lowest category, although I'm sure a lot of you guys would rank this one more towards the top. But I'm also an Ilia Topuria fan, so I kind of have to balance it out and say, yeah, I was sad for a few minutes for sure, but then I ended up just being so happy to see Ilia Topuria get that win and set himself up for a potential fight against Islam Makhachev, because for me, that's the best fight to make in the UFC right now. So I feel like that silver lining pushes it down for me. But then we get into Poatan versus Yuri Prochazka 2. This one was very sad for me, being a Yuri fan, just enjoying the guy. I was hoping that Yuri would get this win so that we could see the trilogy, but Poatan went out there and showed that he's just levels above Yuri. He really is. And it doesn't matter how much samurai training, fucking sound, and sleep deprivation this guy gives himself to train the mind. It does not matter. He cannot get it done against Poatan. Poatan just had his number. But the visual of Yuri trying to fight back to his feet and with his war hair all bent out of shape, and the bow that he gave Poatan afterwards, it just was very sad for me. And honestly, just thinking about it now, crippling depression, even though I like Poatan. In fact, I love Poatan, right? I think he's one of the best fighters in the UFC right now. He's one of the biggest stars in the history of the sport at this point, to be completely honest. And he's saved multiple cards, and I have no reason not to love Poatan. I think he's such a great fighter. But I also am just a huge fan of Yuri Prochazka and the type of fighter that he is. He just goes out there, bangs it out every single time, but against his better judgment, and leads to knockout losses like this. And it was just very, very sad for me to witness. Even though I was happy for Poatan, I was also very, very sad for Yuri Prochazka. Then we get into Jose Aldo versus Peter Yan. And this one was sad because of the late stoppage. It was just a great fight leading up to the late stoppage, but then it turned into my favorite fighter in the UFC beating on like my second favorite fighter in the UFC. So it was sad, but I was conflicted. So not sure if I would say this one put me into a depression. I wouldn't even say that it actually ruined my day. I was probably sad for a few minutes, but then I was just back to being absolutely elated at the fact that Peter Yan won a fight like that against a name like Jose Aldo. And yeah, I guess, I mean, it was sad, but at the same time, is it sad? Yes, because of the stoppage, but otherwise, no, it's not sad for me. Volkanovski versus Horse Meat, my boy, Alistair Overeem. This one is quite sad, dude. It was sad. He got beat up from beginning to end. The finish was sad. Just all around. This was I would say a mild depression moment right here. Then we get into probably one of the saddest fights of all time, and that is Justin Gaethje versus Tony Ferguson. Now, this one I think made me question my love for the sport. Not even because I was like a huge Ferguson fan at the time. I've never been like a humongous El Kakui fan and like propping him up as like a future title challenger and the boogeyman for Khabib. I never bought into all that personally. but I just enjoyed watching Tony Ferguson fight because he would go out there, be weird, throw sand in his opponent's eyes, imaginary sand, and entertain the fans. And it's hard not to respect a man for that. But I feel like Justin Gaethje was always just the worst possible matchup for him, throwing hammers the way that he throws hammers, and Tony Ferguson usually wearing damage pretty well, but getting hurt in a lot of his fights. I feel like everything, like all the factors were leading to this idea that exactly what happened was going to happen, so it wasn't really a surprise to see him get beat. But to see him get beat in the fashion that he was, especially after he lands that uppercut late in round one, I guess a lot of people were thinking that, oh shit, maybe Ferguson can get the win here. But then it just, proceeded to get worse and worse and worse for Ferguson, culminating into that jab that caused that weird reaction from Ferguson. One of the saddest moments in MMA history. Yeah, without a doubt, this one made me question my love for the sport 100%. And then we get into Islam versus Volk. Now, I would say this one ruined my day because in a way it's sad, but in another sense, it's all Volkanovski's fault. He should not have taken the fight at short notice. So, the visual of seeing Volkanovski get KO'd for the first time in the UFC, it sucked to see. But at the end of the day, he was to blame for it. So on one hand, I was sad. On the other hand, I was thinking, like, Volkanovski, you're a dumbass. Why would you take this fight being all tubby and shit? Like, he didn't even look in fight shape. So I guess the result wasn't that surprising in hindsight. Then we get into Gutierrez versus Frankie Edgar, another knee knockout and just nasty knockout. And I just don't really like Chris Gutierrez. I don't like him as a fighter. So for him to do that to Frankie was kind of annoying. I would say this one gave me mild depression. Not as much as the Sandhagen one, because that one came first, and then all these subsequent knockouts on Frankie Edgar, after the fact, weren't as surprising. You know what I mean? But then we get into Michael Chandler versus Tony Ferguson. Now this one I feel like is overshadowed. So I'm gonna say sad for a few minutes because the knockout was so spectacular and so insane. My jaw was to the floor, and it kind of took away from the sadness of it. And also, we had already seen the Gaethje versus Tony fight, so I guess we had all expected this to happen. But I guess it was made even sadder by the fact that Tony had a good round one and actually dropped Michael Chandler. So no, day ruin 100%. Then we get into John Jones versus Lyoto Machida, just choking out a legend out cold, ushering in a new era. I would say sad for a few minutes because I was just so in awe at how badass the visual was of John Jones choking him out, dropping him on the floor, completely limp and walking away like a badass. It was a great moment. And then we get into Islam Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier. Now, Dustin Poirier is one of my favorite fighters of all time, and he was doing so well in this fight, I think, superseding a lot of people's expectations. But then to get ankle picked and darsed in the last few minutes of the fight in such a closely fought contest, it was sad. It was sad to see. He wanted it. You could tell that he was probably better prepared for that fight than any other fight throughout Dustin's career. And for me, it just seemed like it was his last attempt at a belt, especially at his age. And for him to get finished so late like that in such an impressive fashion too. So it was sad on one hand, but I was also so impressed on the other. And I was just so proud of Dustin for going out there and performing better than I think anyone expected him to. So I'm going to put this one in mild depression because I was also just impressed by Islam at the same time, and Dustin did do me proud. So not enough to say crippling depression, but mild depression 100%. Then we get into Chris Weidman versus Anderson Silva. This one was awful. It was awful. I was going to put the first Chris Weidman Silva knockout in here, but it was all Anderson's fault, and that one didn't upset me. It kind of just pissed me off. This one was unfortunate, very, very unfortunate. I'm going to say crippling depression. I wouldn't say it made me question my love for the sport as much as the Uriah Hall one did, but at the same time, did it? Kind of. I mean, it was more just shocking, but I think a lot of people were expecting Anderson to lose again. But yeah, the injury itself was just so gruesome that maybe it is worth putting at the very, very top here. Making me question my love for the sport. Yeah, just the gruesome visual of it was just nasty. And then we get into Khabib versus Dustin Poirier. Now, this one, I think, gave me more depression than the Islam one, just due to the fact that, as I said, Islam versus Dustin was a great fight. This one was just relatively dominant from Khabib, And I think what everyone was expecting to happen just ended up happening in the end. And you could just tell how much Dustin wanted it, the way he was beating himself up afterwards. It was tough. It was a tough one to take as a major Dustin Poirier fan. So yeah, crippling depression, 100%. And then we get into the Korean Zombie versus Max Holloway, another fight that should have never happened. Korean Zombie on his way out, Max Holloway still in his prime. Made no sense to make this fight. Exactly what happened was expected to happen, but it's the reaction from the Korean Zombie afterwards. The love that he was shown during his walkout, post-fight, everything. It was just so beautiful that it gave me crippling depression. It really did. This loss was terrible to witness. And then we get into Israel Adesanya versus Robert Whittaker. Now this one, it's less sad than it is annoying. I've just always been a big fan of Robert Whittaker's and have always been a bit of an Israel Adesanya hater, as you guys know. So when he knocked him out like that, very impressive knockout, and then the celebration that came afterwards, I would say it ruined my day. It more annoyed me than anything. But then we get into Usman versus Gilbert Burns. Now this one I would say is sad for a few minutes. I wasn't really too into their beef that they had going on. I guess they had trained before, and then that culminated to this weird tense moment before the fight where Usman wouldn't even like touch gloves with Burns, and it seemed like a very weird, bitter situation. And then the way he knocked out Burns looked so dejected, so down on himself, and Usman looked like he had just like killed a family member of his or some shit like that. Like he looked genuinely remorseful about what he had just done to Gilbert Burns. So I guess for that reason, it left me sad for a few minutes. But at the end of the day, I'm not really a major fan of either of them, although I respect both of them as fighters. But then we get into Peter Yan versus Merab Dvalishvili. Now I'm putting it right into questioning my love for the sport, because this fight genuinely did. Not even because it was a sad beatdown, but because of the nature of the win for Merab. Left Peter Yan unable to do anything, constantly shooting for takedowns. My blood was boiling while watching this fight, and I genuinely did feel like this sport is not worth watching after it. And that I feel like was a common reaction after the O'Malley-Merab fight, even though what Merab did to Peter Yan was a lot more boring and just straight up spammy. Like I've never seen someone spam as effectively as Merab spammed takedowns against Peter Yan. It was like playing an online ranked match in UFC 5. That's exactly how it felt against a grappling and clinch spammer. If you've ever played UFC 5 or UFC 4 for that matter, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That is pretty much what I witnessed Merab do to Peter Yan, and it was terrible to witness. So yeah, it definitely made me question my love for the sport. Then we get into Ilia Topuria versus Volkanovski. Now this one would definitely be sad for a lot of people. It was a lot less sad than the Islam knockout because at this point, I guess people were predicting this to happen. Topuria, at that point, he was being a bit underestimated, while I was personally picking him to win. And I feel like a lot of people were counting Ilia out, Volk included. So for that reason, this one didn't really upset me. It didn't. I feel like this one just straight up made sense to happen and allowed for a new era of UFC featherweight champion to reign in Ilia Topuria. So for me, this was good for the sport and ultimately didn't upset me really in the slightest. Actually, that's kind of not true. It did upset me at the time, I remember. But in hindsight, yeah, not really that bad of an outcome, to be honest. Then we get into Justin Gaethje versus Donald Cerrone. Now, this one is sad because they were friends, right? They were friends, training partners. Justin Gaethje clearly didn't want to put a beat down on Cerrone, but the ref kind of made him put extra damage, unnecessary damage on Cerrone, and this one was always going to happen. Similar to like the Korean Zombie versus Max Holloway, it didn't really make sense to even make this fight because Cerrone was so old at the time and Gaethje was on a fucking warpath, so why are you matching them up? It didn't really make sense, but I would say I was sad for a few minutes afterwards. Yeah, I would say so. I was never like a major fan of Cowboy Cerrone, even though I do respect him and his activity and his longevity in his career. I just wasn't sad enough, as a fan. I was more of a fan of Justin at the time, so I was happy to see him win, but at the same time, shitty to see Cowboy Cerrone go down like that, although we had seen him go down like that many times before, so it's not like it was a novelty, And then we get into Francis Ngannou versus Cain Velasquez. tough one. This was a tough one to watch. Just so excited to watch Kane return. But I think a lot of people were expecting this to happen. He kind of blew out his knee as well. But I think it's just the knowledge, knowing that it would probably be the last time we ever see Kane fight, that made this loss more sad. So I'll put it in day ruined. Then we get into Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira. Now, I know there are a lot of Charles super fans out there, and I'm going to be honest here. All of you Charles super fans who were saying that he was going to destroy Islam Makhachev, you made this win more satisfying than it had to be, because I was hoping that Charles would win this fight too. But when Islam won, I didn't really give a shit, in all honesty. I was kind of happy for Islam because of the Charles fans way downplaying Islam's skills. So I would say sad for a few minutes on that one. Then we get into DC versus Stipe. It's hard not to love Stipe. But by the way, this is obviously the first DC Stipe fight. The eye pokes and then the knockout in the first round. It was just sad because it happened right after the eye pokes. Stipe wasn't really complaining much, and then to see him flatten like that, it sucked. Weird circumstances. The celebration from DC. I'm glad he got him back in the third fight with those nasty eye pokes, because he really did kind of cheat it in a way, right? Just the fact that he poked the eye, the same side that he ended up landing the shot on that knocked out Stipe. You know what I mean? It all seemed to be perfect circumstances for Daniel Cormier. It was a sad one, but I'll put that one at mild depression. Then we get into Anthony Johnson versus Gustafsson. This one is sad because Gustafsson, a huge fan of his, always one of the nastiest boxers in UFC history. He was so much fun to watch. But to be knocked out like that and eat so many unanswered shots from Anthony Johnson in Stockholm as well. I believe it was in Stockholm, Sweden. So in Gustafsson's home country. So it was just sad to see him lose like that and to eat all the unnecessary damage from Anthony Johnson after already being dropped and clearly out of the fight. It made no sense. So I believe it was Jason Herzog. You're the reason why this fight is so damn depressing, man. And then we get into, I believe, that Shogun Rua versus Ihor Potieria. This one sucked because it was Shogun Rua's last fight, and Ihor Potieria couldn't even give him the basic level of respect. It was a weird one, so it was more annoying than it was anything else. And of course, this was an expected result because Ihor Potieria was the younger guy, and Shogun was clearly on his way out. So it wasn't super sad for that reason, but I would just say the lack of respect from Potieria was the most sad aspect of this fight. So I would say mild depression for that one. Glover Teixeira versus Anthony Smith. Now this one did not ruin my day or anything, just because I've never been a huge fan of Anthony Smith, and I've always loved Glover Teixeira. So to see him put on a dominant performance like that was great. But I would say it did make me a little bit sad just because of the unnecessary damage that Anthony Smith was taking, talking about his teeth falling out and all this shit. It was a sad fight to watch. I didn't feel good watching it. And it just seemed like Glover knew that he didn't really need to put an additional beat down on Anthony Smith, but he had to at the same time so the ref would stop it. And it was an interesting, merciful finish from Glover Teixeira. It was like he was trying to deliver the least amount of damage possible while still delivering enough to make the ref stop the fight. It was a weird one, and it did make me a bit sad. But as someone who's never really been crazy about Anthony Smith, I also just didn't really give a shit at the same time. Then we get into John Jones versus Shogun Rua. Now this one, similar to the Machida one, it was clear that a new generation of fighters was being ushered in. And I've always been such a Shogun fan. And the reason why I will rank this one above the Machida loss to John Jones is because Shogun Rua was one of my favorite fighters of all time. He was one of, if not my top 3 favorite fighters during the Pride era as well. So to see a young up-and-comer like John Jones put a beating on the legend that is Shogun Rua the way that he did, it was something that at the time I didn't expect, and it did upset me quite a bit. And then we get into Wonderboy Thompson versus Anthony Pettis. This one sucked, very similar to the Joaquin Buckley one. He was doing so well, clearly winning the fight, and then a big right hand, dude. Wonderboy Thompson is just a sucker for a big right hand when he's winning a fight clearly. This one was sad, although I'd always really liked Anthony Pettis as well. So I was happy to see Pettis get the win, but also very sad to see him knock out my boy Wonderboy. So I'll say even it out. positive elation from watching Anthony Pettis get a knockout win, but then depression, crippling depression, if anything, from watching Wonder Boy get knocked out like that. So I would say evens it out and puts that one at mild depression. Now, last but not least, we have Andre Muniz versus Jacare Souza. Tough one, really. Tough one. Had always loved Jacare, just such a marauder, elite jiu-jitsu, nasty hands as well. And he got his arm snapped by Andre Muniz here. And he looked relatively unbothered by it too, Jacare. So that was an interesting visual to see him just look mildly inconvenienced by having his arm snapped by Andre Muniz. So the fact that he wasn't on the floor like writhing around in pain took away from the sadness factor. But just knowing how big of a fan I've always been of Jacare Souza, and the fact that was the last time we would ever see him fight, right? That was the last time we had ever seen Jacare Souza fight. So to go out like that is extremely sad, in all honesty. But I'll put this one at mild depression. And that does conclude the tier list, everybody. Please let me know in the comment section below whether you agree, whether you disagree, which fights you think I left out, and really your thoughts overall on the video. And as always, guys, I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you on the next one.